Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel where we do painting tutorials. Like always, I start by taping down my paper and I start coloring the sky with some phthalo blue just on the top corners, and then I take my light ultramarine from the set and I color the center. I take my watercolor brush and I start blending from light to dark, so from the space we left white towards the ultramarine and the phthalo blue. Then I clean my brush, I crumple up the tissue I used to dry my brush on, and I gently press it to the wet paint to lift off some of it and give some very soft clouds. While it dries, I take a scrap piece of watercolor paper and I apply phthalo blue, helio blue reddish, a bit of cat orange, and earthy green. I'm going to use this improvised palette to mix shades I do not have in my pencil set, so I try to go for a grayish green here and I use it to paint the mountain I have in the background, and once that one dries, I mix a slightly darker shade with a bit more blue and a bit more orange, and I paint a mountain that is closer to us. Since I'm using very thin layers, very little water, it usually takes 2 to 3 minutes for the layers to dry in between them, but keep in mind that it's also affected by the temperature and humidity levels in your area. While it dries, I take my dark yellow and I do these weird rectangles. Then I apply some raw umber and some yellow ochre on top of it, and I color everything else with my earthy green. I apply it in all random directions because I'm going to be painting some grassy fields, some wheat fields, and you know how they almost look like a checkers pattern? So that's what I'm going for. If drawing is not your thing, there is a traceable to this and all of my other tutorials over at my Patreon page, Sunshine Arts, and we also do full-time tutorials there, and you can get exclusive digital downloads. And like always, all of the supplies used and the reference picture will be linked down below in the description box. And I take my brush with some water on it. I first blend my yellowish wheat fields because I go from light to dark, and then I do everything that is covered in green. While it dries, I go back to that scrap piece of paper and I mix a green that is slightly darker than the mountains, and I do all of the shadows, or maybe it's a forest, I don't know, on top of the mountains. Just some random blobs and some random shapes, nothing too fancy here. Once that dries, I take my earthy green and I try to figure out where I want my latest mountain. I lightly sketch it out with my green watercolor pencil because if I don't like it, it's a watercolor pencil, it's water soluble, so it's just going to blend with the mountain I'm about to paint, and I don't have to worry about messing it up. Then I mix a slightly more vibrant green and I paint my mountain with it. I add some random dots on the previous mountains for maybe some rocky areas or caves or some random trees that are popping on the mountain, I don't know. Then I use that same mix to divide on the plots of the land with some I don't know, maybe some bushes or some small trees that are separating them. So I just outline them with some lines and then tap over them randomly to make these tree shapes, and I make bigger shapes on the bottom right corner. While it dries, I take my earthy green and I scribble on top of the fields in random directions. Some go from the top left towards the bottom right, some go from the top right towards the bottom left, some are horizontal, some are diagonal. I just try to keep it as random as I can. Then I take my helio blue reddish and I add the shadows under those division trees I just did. I also add some more trees with my dark blue. They're right beneath that last mountain we did. And then I take my brush and I try to soften up all of those shadows with my blue. For the random blobs I did on the bottom right corner, I just go over them with my earthy green to make them a bit more vibrant, a bit more saturated. And then I use my helio blue to add the shadow on the bottom of those trees and a bit on the bottom left side of each one of them. Then I take my yellow ochre and I add some texture to those wheat fields, just some vertical lines, then some horizontal lines. I add a green underlayer of those trees I did there under the mountains, and then I take my brush and I start activating. I use mostly a tapping motion on top of the trees because I want texture. And with my green, I add a bit more lines and a bit more of those tiny tree shapes along the green fields. They're further up in the distance. Then again, under each tree, I do a bit of a blue shadow, and then the big shadow that is casted from the entire line of trees. I take some brown and go on top of the blue with it to further darken it up. And I also use it right under the mountains and for the yellow fields, because blue and yellow would make a green, but brown tends to mute it down just a slight bit. I take my black watercolor pencil and I do some very tiny lines for tree trunks, and I just hover the pencil on top of the page for a very subtle shadow. I cover any blanks on the trees with my green, and I thought I'd add a bit more of the earthy green to that second mountain we have. I don't know, it was looking a bit too pale, a bit too transparent, so I just did a very light layer of my earthy green. Lastly, I do some tiny random green dots all over my fields, all over those yellow and green fields. Then I outline the bottom with my helio blue and I do a very small black line under them, and that's how I draw my tiny trees there further up in the distance. Add as many or as few as you like. I think they look very cute and they just tie this whole painting together. I just do some finishing touches, adding a bit more green to those trees that are further up in the distance, then their tree trunks and the shadows. Once I took off the tape, that second mountain was still looking a bit too pale, so I just quickly activated the green, and what activating does, it just makes the color much more vibrant, and you can really now see that green just pop out of the whole background scenery. And with that, we're done. I'd like to give a very special thank you to my Patreon supporters for the month of March, and thank you all for watching. We'll see each other in the next video. Bye bye!